All right, good afternoon. Welcome, everyone, to our Improving Restorations webinar series. My name is Wade Johnson with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. I'm helping to moderate and keep this webinar moving this afternoon. This webinar is I will start off with this webinar is a partnership between the University of Minnesota Extension's the Restoring Minnesota program and the Legacy Fund Restoration Evaluation Program coordinated by Minnesota DNR and the Board of Water and Soil Resources. Today's webinar is on, it's all about teamwork, about partnerships and project teams and restoration projects. We'll be hearing today from, Kyle Arola with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, Fish and Wildlife, and from Dr. Susan Gladowicz from the University of Minnesota about their work. This is the part where I did intros and bios. Whoops, I meant to give bios to them. Kyle is a assistant area wildlife manager in Thief River Falls, working on a lot of different habitat restoration projects. Dr. Susan Gladowicz is the chair of the Department of Fisheries Biology and Conservation Biology at the University of Minnesota, with an emphasis on ecological restoration and improving restoration outcomes. If you want to ask questions at any point during today's webinar, please use the Q&A feature. That will enable us to field those questions. And if you had technical questions, you can use the chat box for that, but please put questions into the Q&A and we'll field those at the end. Please, after the presentation, take some time to fill out the short survey that'll pop up when you leave the webinar. This really gives us an opportunity to focus on topics for future webinars and also to make improvements to focal areas that we're working on. And if you missed something today or want to share this webinar with others in the future, this webinar and all of the webinars in the series will be posted up on the Restoring Minnesota webpage through Extension, the link that you used to register for this webinar, and we'll be sharing that through a lot of other venues as well. This is a series of 4. 2 weeks ago, we heard about restoration plans and documentation. Today, we'll be hearing again about restoration project teams. 2 weeks from now, we'll be hearing more about stream restorations in Minnesota. And then 4 weeks from now, focus on lakeshore restorations. Again, this is a collaborative effort between the University of Minnesota Extension, Restoring Minnesota, and the Ecological Restoration Training Collaborative. That program has 5 different courses. There will be new sessions starting up in August, and registration will be open in June. This is a link here, and we encourage you all to look into that opportunity for early career professionals to identify, learn some priority foundational skills in restoration planning and management. We at the Legacy Fund Restoration Evaluation Program, collaboration between Minnesota DNR and Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources. We focus on collaborating with experts to evaluate restorations and identifying what's working in the field and really some of the ongoing challenges, and hope to share some of that information to improve future restorations. And that's exactly what we're hoping to do with today's webinar series. And without further ado, I will hand it off to Kyle Arola to talk about his work and planning for teams. So Kyle, please go right ahead. Thank you. Kyle, it looks like you're muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. I lost where the mute button was. Okay, well, everybody, thanks for taking the time over your lunch hour to join us today. What I will be going over is an introduction to Thief Lake and the different work activities that we do here. And that will give you a better understanding of why teamwork is so important with the work we do. The restoration evaluation team was up here back in October, and we looked at 2 different sites. So I will be specifically talking about those 2 sites and how teamwork came together to accomplish the work that we did there. And then ultimately, we will go over some tips on building successful teams. Okay, so where we are in Minnesota, we are in the far northwest corner of the state. If you go north 1 hour, you will be in Manitoba. If you go 1 hour to the west, you'll be in North Dakota. We fall right on the transition zone between the tallgrass aspen parkland and Laurentian mixed forest, and that adds to a lot of diversity in the plant communities and wildlife. So if you go to the west end of the work area, you're going to find more prairies and oak savannas. As you move to the east, you'll find more expansive brushlands, aspen forests, black spruce bogs, and the work activities we do oftentimes are mimicking natural disturbances. So for instance, if we're working in prairies or oak savannas, in the western portion, we're doing a lot of prescribed fire. As you go to the east, there's more brushland work, timber harvest, those sorts of things. The work we do, we are home to the Grigla elk herd. So yes, we do have several different elk herds in Minnesota. Like I said, the Grigla one, and then if you go to the northwest of me, there's a few herds in Kittson County in the extreme northwestern corner of the state. So work activities that we do for elk include the prescribed fire, a lot of brushland work, and it's important to note that we may be doing those work activities for the elk. There's a wide variety of species that benefit, anywhere from golden wing warblers to sharp-tailed grouse to white-tailed deer. Our staff in the field operate a lot of heavy equipment. So those are a couple bulldozers there, and they are working on installing fire breaks, and ultimately we can carry out large burns. We will typically do anywhere between 1,000 to 5,000 acres in a given season. Thief Lake itself is just over 7,000 acres. It's a shallow lake. It's managed primarily for waterfowl. Some of the activities that we do out there are aquatic plant surveys. The last one that we did was in the summer of 2019, and we documented just under 30 species of submersed aquatic plants. And what's really great about the lake is we don't know of any exotic species in it. So no curly leaf pondweed or Eurasian water milfoil. We do have scattered pockets of purple loosestrife and a fringe of hybrid cattail around the lake, and we actively manage those infestations to keep them in check and prevent further spread. Typically this time of year, if you haven't been up to this corner of the state, it's very flat. A 2 to 3 inch rain event can cause significant flooding. This year we did not receive a lot of snow. It's underwhelming, but when we have those flood events, there's a lot of coordination with townships, counties, watershed districts, and of course the private landowners, both upstream and downstream of Thief Lake. The main reason I got into wildlife management is I really like the research and monitoring side of things. So we do quite a few things here at Thief Lake, anywhere from breeding pair counts on waterfowl in the spring to aerial surveys of duck populations that are here in the fall. And we do some radio collar projects. We've done a fair amount with black bears. And a few years ago, we collared 20 cow elk to look at some seasonal habitat use. So just an example of some of the different research projects we do. So to kind of recap, we have 115,000 acres of wildlife management area. that we manage just in the Thief Lake work area. Right now, we have 2.5 staff. So 2 weeks ago, I had one staff member retire. And then with the COVID situation that we're in and the hiring freeze, we haven't filled any positions. So 2.5 staff can only get so much done. That comes out to be 46,000 acres per person. So how in the world do we get this all done? Teamwork. So before I get into the specific examples, I just want to touch quick on how we prioritize. Here at Thief Lake, we have a management plan. We just updated this back in 2017, and it covers all of the different work activities that we do, from wetlands to forests, what we prioritize, and how we go about accomplishing that work. So there's a section on invasive species, and that's what I will be talking about today. So if we jump back to 2013, I had just started working here at Thief Lake, and I was on a tour with my supervisor of the work area, and we're driving along the south side of the lake, and there's about a 10-acre field that was 50% covered in these white flowers. And I asked, but you know what that is? And he thought it was Queen Anne's lace, but after a closer look, it wasn't. I tried to key it out. I didn't have any luck. So I reached out to Three Rivers Park District. I had formerly worked there as a wildlife aide, and one of the individuals I worked with was a plant expert. So I called him up, talked about it, described what we had, sent some pictures, and the wild part is they had just identified the same species on one of their parks earlier that summer. So it's brunette saxifrage. And at that time, back in 2013, after we found this infestation, it was only documented in Minnesota, in Pine County, back in the mid-1980s, now on one of Three Rivers Park District's parks, and up here in Marshall County. So obviously there's probably more out there, and we'll get to that in a second. So obviously Three Rivers was early on in experimenting how to go about treating this. And what I did is I looked up Wisconsin DNR, and at the time they had this species documented in, I believe, 8 counties, and they had been working on it for a while. And in short, what was successful for them was mowing the plant before it goes to seed, and then following up with spot spraying with Garland 3A. So we also have a Nature Conservancy office up in the Northwest and located in Carlstead that shares an office with the Carlstead Wildlife Office. And they periodically will come over and help us with invasive species and prescribed burning. So they came over, we worked together to start treating this, to limit the spread, and we have had okay success. But another thing is, this picture is from that fall of 2013. Obviously, if the county or township is going out later in the season and mowing the roadsides, they're going to spread it if it's gone to seed. So we coordinated with them to delay mowing, and now we work together to time the mowing so it's not taking place at a time of year when it's going to spread the plant. And also private landowners. There was about 1 acre of on a private landowner south of the infested site that had it present, and so we've been working with them since 2014 on their land to again control it, mow it at the appropriate time, try to best limit the spread. So since 2013, when we had 3 documented locations in the state, with Three Rivers Park District, the Minnesota DNR, and the Department of Agriculture, we've sent out emails, spread the word, and now you can see it's located in quite a few counties in Minnesota. So what I will make a plug quick here is, if you have an invasive species, whether it's a plant or animal, you can go onto the DNR site and take pictures, record a GPS point and report it so we have a better understanding of where these occurrences are and ultimately how we can work together to control them and limit further spread. Okay, so after that example, now I'll get into what has worked well for me for building successful teams. Number one, and I believe this is the most important, is networking. This is something that is ongoing. Meeting different people from different backgrounds is always a good thing. If you have projects that come up, you can work together, get different areas of expertise, and maximize those projects. So next is identifying a project. So with the example I just had, okay, we have this flower. What do we want to do? We want to figure out what it is. Determine the goals. Okay, now we see that it's an invasive species. How are we going to go about treating it and limiting the spread? Communicate with your partners and your teams, and communicate often. Many times we will have meetings and come up with great ideas. Okay, this is what we're going to do when we're going to do it. And then, you know, in today's fast-paced lifestyle, it falls by the wayside. So it's important to, you know, follow up with those phone calls frequently, so everybody's on board, on the same page, and you're working towards those goals. Right behind networking, I would say, is bringing a positive attitude to your teams. That can really go a long way in building the successful teams. And lastly, thank your team members and your partners. This past Saturday, we had a group of volunteers from the University of Minnesota Crookston campus come up for a volunteer brush cut day. And after that, I made sure to send them an email thanking them, you know, letting them know that that work is valued and why it's so important. The benefits of teamwork, you get those different areas of expertise. I'm not a botanist. I reached out and we figured out what that plant was. You bring more ideas to the table. Maybe there's a better way of going about accomplishing your goals. You accomplish more in the team setting, and you build those relationships that can last the expanse of, you know, our careers, depending on where we are. And lastly, it takes the pressure off an individual. So with the example here with 2.5 staff, having those partners to help us out in these different situations can take the pressure off, allow us to do other work, and we're still getting as much done as we can. Okay, example number 2. This dates back to the fall of 2014 at Thief Lake. At that time, we knew of a couple spots on the management area where buckthorn was present, and it was just scattered individuals. But that fall, we got a call from one of our local foresters saying, hey, I was out cruising some timber and you have a pretty serious infestation of buckthorn. So that initiated contacting team members, and this came from networking throughout the past. I spoke with the Deer Hunters Association and Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. We put together a project to treat that buckthorn and ultimately worked with the Student Conservation Association on that particular project. We came up with a map. We identified those areas where the infestations were present. And again, with those Student Conservation Association workers, went out and treated those areas in 2015. Moving forward with those relationships with forestry, this is an email that I received this past fall. One of the foresters was out along the south side of Thief Lake, and as they were driving along, they saw a couple scattered buckthorn plants. So they snapped a couple pictures, took a GPS point, sent that to me. And then when I was out that weekend checking duck hunters, I was able to take care of those plants at that time. So again, it's just building those teams, having that frequent communication when we're at different meetings. You know, I always take the opportunity to say, if you're out and about and you come across an invasive species, whether it's common tansy or buckthorn, just let me know. And that's been working great for us. And this is huge right here. Team members, just for supporting natural resources. This goes back to 2008 when the voters of Minnesota passed the Legacy Amendment, essentially raising sales taxes by 0.3%. Part of that money goes into towards natural resources, and a lot of great work is done through the Conservation Partner Legacy grants that are received by different organizations. And a lot of habitat work is getting done, which is great. One lesson learned from the site evaluations when we went over them in October was planning for ongoing treatment of buckthorn. We did those initial treatments back in 2015. Other things came up. The buckthorn infestation continued, and we had some discussions on site that day. So moving forward, I'm working with forestry to map out the areas where we have high densities, and we will follow up with going out and treating them. And then following that, I'm working with the Minnesota DNR roving crew to develop a burn plan and burn that unit to keep the buckthorn in check. So that's a lesson learned from the site evaluations that we did. Okay, so in conclusion, the main points that I want you to take away is networking. That's an ongoing effort, even before any projects come up. Getting to know a lot of different people from different organizations can really go a long way in the long run. Ask yourself what you want to accomplish. Is it a wetland restoration, cattail management, invasives? Identify that project, and then you can reach out to potential partners and see how you can work together to move forward. And again, the big thing is communication. Send that email, or even better, pick up the phone, give those partners a call, and stay in touch. And have fun. The work that we do is very rewarding, and to enjoy it. And yeah. Okay, so I don't know where I'm at on time, but that's all I had.
Thank you, Kyle. I think we're actually right on time, given my intro. Next up, Sue Gladowicz. Please take it away, Sue.
Okay, can everybody see my screen? It's always a bit of a mystery for the speaker. I'll assume you can.
Looks good.
What's that?
Looks good.
Okay, well, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's great to follow up after Kyle, because he provided so many sort of good examples of some points I'll make as well today. So thanks, Kyle, for a great talk. So what I'll be talking about today is what we understand about the linkage between the various aspects of restoration teams and how it affects restoration outcomes, and what do we understand about that. My talk today will use 4 different, types of insights that I've gleaned over the years. Partly of some of what you'll hear today are things that have come out of my participation in the restoration evaluation panel. Also some research findings from a research project that Julia Bonin and I completed about a year ago. A review that I'm doing right now on organizations or teams, and then interviews that I did when I wrote my restoration textbook. So all of those things play into the guidance and insights I'll provide today. So when I'm talking about teams, I'm using organization as a synonym here. An organization is just any organized group of people with a particular purpose. That group could be 2 people, like Kyle was describing, and all the people he networks with eventually, or it could be a large group. But the point is that they're organized to accomplish a particular purpose. So, you know, basically, what are you trying to accomplish and what are you going to need to do that? And so if you take a look at this diagram, restorations require oftentimes more time than we initially have funding for. Even our simplest restorations really take at least a decade to recover. Things like prairie potholes or tallgrass prairie really kind of fully hit their stride after about 10 years, and forests and bogs take much longer. That outcome really depends on the capacity of the organization responsible for the project. And that organization needs to have expertise, the specific skills. They also need to know how to leverage external partners, as Kyle described, volunteers, contractors, other organizations. They need to do all those things in order to be able to deploy the best practices for the problem at hand. And so one aspect of that is the expertise of the individuals. And many of our projects do require broad expertise. But note that individuals are plugged into a team. And so even if you have a tremendously skilled individual or two, if you're, the way you are operating as a team isn't quite adequate, that expertise could really not make the difference. And so we'll talk a little bit about that today. How do you make sure you both have the expertise and then also effective operations? Okay, so key issue number one, I'll be talking about 3 key issues today for guidance. And the first one is rather straightforward. This, are you missing expertise on your team? And some of this guidance comes from our work on the restoration evaluation panel. We will see this, most commonly, I would say, where a team requires people from other professions. And so Kyle talked about his way that he compensates for that by reaching out to people in professions other than his. We'll see that, for instance, on projects where there's a lot of engineering or sort of physical science profession expertise that's needed. And they may forget they need some botanists around to come up with a really solid plant list. Or if you've got what is mostly a re-veg project and people have not adequately addressed soil erosion control practices, it reflects basically a lack of reaching out to people that you might not know so well. And so we see that, certainly often enough that it's an important thing to keep in mind. You might need to make new friends in places that you don't normally collaborate with. We also see this issue when you have a team with very limited experience. And so this is an issue of you may not know, what you don't know. So you're going into a project, your team has so little experience, they may not know what expertise they're going to need. So those are 2 common circumstances that we see. What's the outcome of that? The restoration outcome is you have a failure then to use best practices, whether it's using a seed mix that is appropriate for the site or missing out on a set of techniques altogether. And then certainly the inability to foresee avoidable risks, just not knowing where the pitfalls might be. So the issue then beyond that, you may be able to imagine where your expertise gaps are, but in some cases, it's more than that. And so a restoration team needs, in addition to expertise that scopes with the project aims, they need the capacity to effectively deal with unexpected events, setbacks, novel challenges. And when you think about invasive species as an example, but there are many other examples in restoration, all of these things come to mind. That all fits under, an umbrella of what's called organizational resilience. And the framework you have here, you see here, is basically a conceptual framework that's been used in natural hazard response because nothing like this has been written up for research for restoration yet. And it's a pretty common framework, and that would be that organizational resilience has kind of 2 components. One is situation awareness, and the other one is how you manage your keystone vulnerabilities. So situation awareness is when you've got a team with people on it that have enough of a sense of what the uncertainties are in a project and are able to be aware of the risks that a project like the one you're embarking on might face, and being sort of ahead of the game and watching out for those problems. And Kyle gave you some examples of that when he noticed that unusual plant on the roadside. That was an example of, something went, a bell went off in his head and like, that looks a little odd. That's an example of situation awareness, saying, we might have a risk here, and then sort of seeking out something to do about it. Management of keystone vulnerabilities is really about your operations. So where situation awareness is sort of knowing enough to be able to assess risks and account for them, management of keystone vulnerabilities is really the aspects of your operations that allows you to sort of proceed and in many different ways make appropriate decisions and take actions. And so we've all been in situations where we knew that a risk was heading our way, but we really couldn't influence the operations of a particular project to be able to be taken seriously enough or whatever to get that, to have that matter. And so that's what keystone vulnerabilities are about, is basically how do you operate, and are you going to be able to sort of use the best information that your team has. Together, they comprise what is adaptive capacity. And these are a set of indicators that teams can use to self-evaluate, basically if they have any issues or if they should be thinking about team building in a different way. So Kyle talked about communications and relationships. That's a big one. In bigger teams, avoiding silo mentality. Basically, how do you share information, who makes decisions, and so on. You can read the larger list here. And so all of these sort of issues then become something that are tangible. They're no longer theoretical, especially if you go one step further and put them in sort of a checklist that matters in your particular context. But we have a lot to learn yet before we've got something that is a self-assessment tool for teams, but we are working on it. What you see here is the same diagram as before, but in the lower left, what we have is the number of publications, research publications, that have come out on the topic of organizational resilience in the past few decades. And what you'll see is in the last decade, this topic has really soared in terms of importance. Primarily in natural hazard response, public health, business, and some industries as well. Natural resources has a little slice of this, but not too great yet. And what we know from this whole body of work so far, though, is that assessing organizational resilience is context dependent. While this framework might have sort of broad utility, actually sort of understanding how to deploy it in our circumstance, in say conservation and restoration, natural resource management, deserves a lot more attention. Our teams sort of are structured in different ways, for instance, than if you were in an industry that was making hard drives for computers, as an example. And a lot of what we know comes from businesses and is not necessarily that relevant. Although certainly natural hazard response and public health has some overlaps. Teams come together very quickly, a pulse of labor, and then a long-term need to stay on top of a situation that could reverse if you can't stay on top of it. So there are some parallels. But we became interested, Julia Bonin and I became interested in exploring this topic some more when we had an opportunity to work on a restoration evaluation that the Legislative and Citizens Commission for Minnesota Resources asked us to do, to evaluate their project and try to come up with some ways to predict which of their projects had been successful and to see how that might influence their project selection in the future. So this became a really interesting opportunity to not only look at ecological factors, things like how degraded is the site, is it a prairie, is it a wetland, how old is the restoration, all those things that we often do, but then also take a look at organizational factors as well, using the framework I just showed you. And we were interested in outcomes, so the extent to which a project is successful. And we basically used mostly vegetation on that, whether it had mostly natives or mostly invasive species. And this is a diagram of the project, basically an overview of the project. We screened 413 projects and then did various data gathering with subsets of those 413 projects, down to the most detailed assessment on 59 projects where we actually did boots on the ground evaluations, looked at the full history of the restoration, interviewed the project managers for those sites, and perhaps some of you were people we interviewed for this project and who helped us on the ground, and I thank you for that. We learned a lot. So with that, and knowing we have a rather limited time today, I won't go into the methods more, but let me go back. If you are interested in learning more about this project in its entirety, it was published this past fall in Restoration Ecology, and I can send you a reprint of that, a PDF of that, if you email me. Okay, so what we did then, this summarizes a bunch of the information that we got out of this project. And so let me tell you what you're looking at here. We looked at 13 primary factors to take a look at how they were related to project outcomes. Project outcomes is what's basically depicted on the graphs here. So the percent of potential natural vegetation is the x-axis, and basically a composite abundance score of invasive species is on the y-axis. And these data were collected through meander surveys of the sort that we talked about in the last restoration seminar 2 weeks ago. So basically broad vegetation surveys, and what's important here is the hashed lines that you see on this field demarcate basically the place where you have either above average amounts of potential natural vegetation or below average potential natural vegetation, and then above average amounts of invasive species versus below average amounts of invasive species. So then basically what you see in the lower right quartile here is the sites that we would consider high quality, relatively high quality compared to the other 59 sites. And the sites that are in the upper left are the ones that are relatively low quality by measuring invasive species versus potential natural vegetation. So lower right is a good place for your project to be, upper left is a bad place for your project to be, and the other two are somewhere in the middle. So then the question is when we take a look at each of these various factors, whether it be how extensive the landscape alteration is surrounding that site, or what is what kind of starting condition was there on the site? Was it a completely converted ag field, or did you have a lot of remnant vegetation there? Did your project have a setback or not? And what was the amount of sort of internal capacity that you had to perform the work? Basically, those are the kinds of things we're looking at there. And that's the circles with the error bars. And so what you can see then is that we had 5 factors that showed the most pronounced relationship between those factors and restoration outcome. And it's a mix of organizational factors like project setbacks and internal capacity, and ecological ones, how degraded the landscape is surrounding your site, what the starting condition was, and what kind of ecosystem you were attempting to restore. We had 8 factors that really didn't show a clear signal. Part of this certainly may be that they weren't important, but in addition to that, some of these, like how well your organization was connected, or even some of what we looked at for external resources, also has to do with some of what we're learning about how to gather this information. And so the methods associated with trying to actually figure out what the level of these are in a particular project. Okay, so a little bit then of the 2 factors that were organizational in nature. And what does that tell us about how we might diagnose what to be concerned about on our teams. Some of the common internal capacity constraints that we observed in our Minnesota projects, the LCCMR projects, is that project managers frequently cited a lack of staffing as a primary reason essential work had not been performed. A lack of personnel with needed expertise, limited access to pulses of staff for labor-intensive work. And it was interesting to hear Kyle talk about the fact that that's just sort of, it is a very common thing. His point of having, 2.5 staff for 115,000 acres is just sort of it makes it very clear that this is, a very common issue. And so the question is, what kind of capacity do you have to overcome that as much as possible? Also, 25% of the projects that we worked on experienced a change in leadership during the span of the restoration. 60% of the projects had no written plan beyond the grant proposal, and 33% of the projects had plans prepared by a third party. And so the key issue number 2 I want to point out here is that when you're embarking on a restoration, one thing to be concerned about is, does your team have an operational plan that is something that goes beyond the grant proposal? So an operational plan that will keep all parties sort of knowing what's happening next and what was intended. The most common circumstances where this becomes a problem, or this is a problem that we saw on the LCCMR project, a research project, we noticed that projects that were funded by pass-through grants oftentimes seem to lack kind of operational documents that would help the team carry through for the duration of a project. Now, this is also post-grant, because the purpose is to restore an ecosystem, not to just burn money on a grant. So pass-through grant is where you might have a development officer for an organization, wrote a nice big grant, promising to do, really dozens and dozens of projects with several partners. The thing gets funded, the money gets divvied out, and then it sort of passes through, cascades down out into the area where the project's actually happening. And oftentimes the money arrives, but it's not really clear sort of what happens next. And that means that's an issue of, was there an assessment of the staffing that was going to be needed to actually carry out the work? So there's a disconnect between the promise or the aims and between, what you've got available on the ground to do that. So again, multi-partner projects with no clear lead is another situation where we see some issues with planning being an issue and causing operational problems. And so in some ways, it's the opposite of what Kyle's got, where he's got 2 people, and he can be sort of clearly in charge, keep the trains running. When you have very large projects that might be bringing people in together, is there somebody in charge? Who's the point person that's keeping it moving over the long term? And then thirdly, in the interest of time, I'll just move on to the third one, is that I think also what we hear as well is the idea that some projects are just too simple to need an operational plan. And certainly you don't need an 80-page plan for everything, but even a simple one, even a couple of pages to record what your intention is, and to communicate that to the network of people that you've needed to involve is really critical. Part of it is that there needs to be a diagnosis of essential staffing that, when lacking, can really hurt a project over the long term. But then the other thing I want to note is part of what sits in that keystone vulnerability part of team capacity is, how do you pass leadership? How do you transition through a leadership change? Is there enough documentation to be able to keep a project going? And so that's an important part of having a written plan, because oftentimes there will be a leadership change before an ecosystem has recovered.
Sue, I think we're just about at time on this one. If we can.
Okay, I got it. Just 2 more slides.
Thank you.
Thanks for the heads up, Wade. Okay, related to setbacks, 20% of Minnesota projects experience substantial setbacks. 50% of, less than 50% of projects kept records with an operational level of detail. And new project managers, meaning those that replaced the ones that had left, expressed concern that a lack of records hindered their capacity to respond to problems, or that they had difficulties enforcing contracts because of lack of information. And so this is an example of a key issue. Is the team aware of risks and prepared to address challenges and contingencies? And so having an internal communication mechanism that's durable, that you can actually track the decisions that were made, and making sure that your decisions can be made on the ground and aren't thwarted by sort of higher level, sort of distant members of the organization. And then that you also have no serious expertise gaps. So the outcome, if you don't have that, is a failure to foresee risks, a lack of timely or effective response to emerging problems, and leadership change can end the restoration projects. So this is my last slide. So it's just a summary of, when your expertise of your team matches your scope, you're going to benefit from best practices and be able to foresee, avoid foreseeable risks. The second one is that if you've got a plan and the planning was like a purposeful opportunity, you'll likely have accounted for essential staffing one way or the other, and you probably will be able to survive a leadership change. And then thirdly, basically, is your team aware of risks and prepared to address contingencies? And if you do, you'll probably have the adaptive capacity needed to respond effectively to setbacks and to survive leadership changes. And that's it.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kyle and Sue. We're now open for some question and answer. Julia, are you on and able to facilitate that Q&A?
Yes, I have myself unmuted. I just lost my button for turning my camera on, but I'm gonna not worry about that. Both, I think this question could be addressed to both Sue and to Kyle. But what do you perceive to be the barriers and challenges to facilitating an effective, robust project team? Kyle, do you want to go first?
Yep. I would say a big thing is all of the competing projects that we have. The work that we do is very, very diverse. There's a lot of different things going on. And then the biggest thing is prioritizing what projects we're going to work on, building that team to focus on that. But I would say looking at all the different competing interests is a barrier in the amount of staff time and availability that we have.
So you could potentially be requiring a couple of teams at minimum simultaneously. And so then you're faced with managing a couple of teams, pulling them together and managing them for different projects.
Correct.
Sue?
Yeah, I would say that I think that what sometimes we see is, and looking at sort of a multitude of different types of teams, is that roles and responsibilities are not always clear, and whether there has been made an upfront commitment or not by various partners is not clear. And so that's what I was advocating for, having a planning process that says, yes, we'll commit this amount of time to do this. And so a lot of it's ad hoc and afterwards, which is always going to be the nature to some extent. But I think in a restoration project where you do have at least an organized beginning, not having a real ironed out sense of who's doing what, I think makes it difficult over time.
So that relationship with a project team needs to be a little bit more formal maybe than it is sometimes, to make sure that everybody's doing their part. Yes, and knows what each other are doing and not doing. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So are there funding and or operational improvements within our model of funding here in Minnesota that could help facilitate more effective project teams? Sue, do you want to take a stab at that first? Yeah, so it's interesting. I think everybody thinks of more money will get you, like, solve the problem, but
actually things like lack of records and lack of communications were cited more frequently by project managers as hindrances than even more money. So I would say sometimes it has to do with how the money is coming at us, at restoration teams, in very short-term blocks. And so I think that's an issue of not having like phase 1, phase 2 opportunities. So if a project's doing well in phase 1, having a way to come back and get a second phase of funding so it matches more the recovery time that an ecosystem normally needs before it needs a whole lot less of us.
And do you see that changing at all? Do you think that's that will happen in the future here?
Well, some grant programs in other states do have phase 1 and phase 2, but there needs to be a lot of structure to determine why a project was in good shape or not, and to document the extent to which it ought to be eligible for a second phase, because that certainly limits then the number of new projects that are started.
And Kyle, do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I would say the biggest thing, an example here is with the buckthorn project that I had, where we identified the issue that we had. We were able to secure funding for it. The project was completed, and then having a follow-up plan. Where are we going to get additional funds to follow up and keep that situation in check?
Right. So you kind of have to stay a step ahead of yourself when you're
Exactly.
working with the team and coordinating that. Kyle, do you want to address whether or not, can you speak to the value or the importance of having internal capacity versus bringing in experts from outside of your organization? Pros and cons?
So the internal knowledge goes a long way, having that site-specific information. But like I covered in my presentation, there's a lot of different things going on, and no one individual can be an expert on everything. So let's say I want to look at doing some moist soil unit management or any project that it may be. It's important to have those connections, have those networks to bring in people that are experts that can guide you, provide recommendations on how best to tackle a situation.
Can I follow up on that too?
Yes, please.
So what's interesting is, when Kyle was talking, I think what was interesting too is, even though they only have 2.5 people, he's got a lot of internal capacity because he can network like crazy and get stuff done. And so internal capacity is not only the number of people on your team. When we saw internal capacity causing problems for a project outcome, it was sometimes because nobody on the team had enough experience to, for instance, network or do a contract for professional services to like get some weed control done. So, some of your small community-based restorations, as an example, will have people who have like no experience doing these kinds of things. So it's not always the number of people, but can you do those very straightforward things that sometimes aren't just straightforward, but networking takes a lot of, well, it takes a lot of connections.
So Kyle, go ahead. I was just going to say, as a follow-up to that, could you suggest how, if you're early in your career, how did you overcome that, your lack of a network?
What I did specifically to build the network is volunteering with different groups, becoming involved in organizations, attending meetings. It's incredible how many people you can meet doing that. So that's why I kind of emphasize in my presentation the importance of networking, getting to know people, and then you're tapping into those different fields, those different expertise.
So potentially you you met some of the Minnesota Deer Hunters Association members or something like that. Is that what you're?
Absolutely. Yes. Yep. And then, getting to know so back to the Deer Hunters Association, making contact with that organization, giving a presentation at one of their meetings and meeting those people. And now it all kind of comes together. They're coming out, they're volunteering with different projects. it can turn into some great relationships and great teams. So always be creative about the teams that you can create, because the sky is the limit, and that can be, county commissioners. There's a lot of coordination with a lot of different players. So always be open-minded.
Great. Sue, I have a question for you. Have some of the flaws in project management discovered in your research led to more focus on team stability and the need for developing operational plans?
Well, I think that it's still too early to know what kind of influence our research has had, because it just came out in September. And certainly one of the things that we need to do in the field of ecological restoration, meaning the research field, is, basically develop more guidance and show more examples of issues of organizations and highlight the things we're talking about today. So I think we're a little early in the game, but hopefully through this kind of work and communicating and talking about it and, networking like we're doing today, some of the issues of some of the different aspects or dimensions of teamwork will come to the fore as things people should be thinking about and deliberately taking attempts to strengthen their approach to restoration. That it's not only about like having one or two real smart people or real knowledgeable people. It's even broader than that. You can have a knowledgeable person who refuses to network, and like Kyle said, they only know their area of expertise. It's more than just kind of having some book knowledge. It's how you put the project all together. So hopefully that will become a much more prominent issue in the coming few years.
I think we have time for just one more question, probably. But for projects that experience leadership diversion, what is the result for these projects? What are the outcomes likely to be? Kyle, do you want to give us your thoughts?
Sure. I guess stepping into the position here, my supervisor retired about 3 years ago now, and I think having a good system in place, documenting the work that you have done, prioritizing the work that needs to get done in the future, and having that place to store that information. So if we have changes in leadership, and you have someone come in that has never been to Thief Lake or wherever, they can pick up on those documents, see how to move forward. And with situations where we have our, I talked about that Thief Lake Wildlife Management Plan, having a good source of information that provides direction. So when there are changes, you have that to go off of.
So that record keeping, as we learned in our first webinar 2 weeks ago, is very important for building these project teams that are going to be effective on the ground.
It's critical.
Great. Well, thank you again both so very much. I think Wade maybe has a couple of housekeeping notes for us.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much, Kyle and Sue, for your presentations and question and answer, and Julia for fielding that very interesting Q&A session. A few things to note. Reminder, there is a survey regarding our webinar series and where you would like to receive information about restorations and restoration training. So please, I beseech you to go ahead and fill out that survey. It'll pop up as soon as you log off of this webinar. Also, a reminder that we have 2 more in this webinar series coming up, 2 weeks from now, focused on stream restoration, and 4 weeks from now, focused on lakeshore restoration. So please tune in to those and feel free to share with others. Free webinar series, and we'd like to get our reach out as far as possible. And without further ado, I don't believe there's any other items we need to include, unless I'm forgetting something, Julia.
I think we're good.
Thanks to everyone for being involved. Thanks to Extension for helping put this on. And again, thanks for Sue and Julie, Kyle, with their time to present and talk about their work. I think this is a really important aspect of restoration practice, and I hope you all got some good lessons from it. And without further ado, thank you all very much. Please tune in 2 weeks.